In Boston during the 1970s, the city faced violence after a federal judge ordered that students be bused across neighborhoods in order to integrate Boston schools. This is the story of that judge and his contribution to the Boston busing crisis. Judge Arthur Garrity came from a family of Irish descent who moved to America and lived in the New England area. Garrity's parents were aware of the desegregation that the Irish people faced in the U.S. His mother would remind Garrity that both the Irish and blacks were desegregated against. His father was even a member of the NAACP. Garrity's family history influenced his belief on busing desegregation in Boston. Garrity was often described as cautious, diligent, and polite. He was especially cautious when deciding cases. Garrity once spent a whole night in a jail to experience a prisoner's perspective and evaluate the living conditions in a prison. His dedication paid off because he had one of the lowest rates of reversal by the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Garrity knew that the Boston schools were segregated on purpose, but before he could do anything, he had to prove it. Although no law dictated segregation, authorities manipulated zoning laws and built schools in order to separate black and white kids. The schools were segregated on purpose, the judge stated. As Garrity prepared to integrate Boston's busing, he looked at past cases such as Swan v. Mecklenburg, which was the first to deal with desegregation in Boston schools in a major urban area. Neighborhoods in Boston were racially segregated, so kids attended schools with other kids of their own race. The Supreme Court ruled that extreme measures could be used to desegregate schools. In this case, that meant using buses to achieve integration. Garrity also referred to the Milliken v. Bradley case. Its decision meant that different school districts could not be combined unless it could be proven that the lines between them were drawn with racist intent. The result of this case prohibited Garrity from using the suburbs as part of the desegregation plan. Milliken essentially assured that desegregation would occur in Boston only and would involve the shuffling of poor white and black students from school to school while the predominantly white suburbs were exempt. Since the school committee refused to submit a plan for the desegregation of Boston, the state had to instead. Charles Glenn was the main architect for the state Phase 1 desegregation plan. Glenn's plan involved busing students from predominantly black Roxbury into predominantly white South Boston and vice versa. The Phase 1 plan was doomed from the beginning because the two neighborhoods were not friendly and did not get along with each other. When Phase 1 was put into practice, the white students were angry with the black students that began desegregating the schools. At South Boston High School, groups of angry whites beat incoming black students. White mobs rocked and egged incoming and outgoing buses, breaking windows and hurting black students on the bus. Phase 1 proved to be violent from the beginning, and since it brought boycotts, riots, and overall chaos, it was clear that Phase 1 was a failure and that they had to make Phase 2 much better in order to fix the issues Phase 1 started. Also, the Phase 1 plan wouldn't have worked from the beginning because the Irish didn't want to lose their white superiority and therefore be equal to the blacks, and Garrity had to develop a more permanent remedy to the segregation. This plan was known as Phase 2. Charles Glenn was the chief architect of this plan. The Phase 2 plan was designed to minimize the violence that had quickly spread after Phase 1 was set into motion. Garrity was handed a plan that may limit violence, but he changed it to better fit the law so as to create more integration despite the fact that it resulted in more violence. Garrity's main role was to come up with a better way to go about the desegregation of Boston public schools. He wanted to change Phase 1 by adding two principal objectives. First, to ensure against reversal on appeal, and second, to overwhelm Boston's persistent opposition to desegregation by the sheer weight of evidence and the power of his logic. Garrity also enforced a more uniform racial ratio on the entire city, not including East Boston. Garrity didn't include East Boston because it was, quote, too black. He was a brilliant judge, but he was more concerned with strictly following the law, and as a result rejected a plan that would have limited the violence. Many whites in Boston were angry at Garrity for forcing integration in schools. It was also perceived by many people in Boston that Judge Garrity was being hypocritical, due to the fact that desegregation was only in Boston and did not affect the suburban area surrounding it. Unbeknownst to these people, the judge was not allowed by the Supreme Court to have the suburbs around Boston to desegregate due to the Milliken v. Bradley case. Throughout the case, Garrity found himself being constantly harassed and threatened by those who opposed the desegregation of Boston. Many felt that it was unfair that wealthy towns like Wellesley weren't affected by the desegregation of Boston. People would come to his house in Wellesley and harass him, forcing him to have a police car parked outside of his house at all times for about a year to protect him. Despite the violence, Garrity was less affected by the physical damage rather than the social isolation he was in. Many of his friends no longer spoke to him, and he was excluded from social gatherings and community events. Although the desegregation plan negatively affected Garrity's life, it eventually made a positive influence on Boston that is still prevalent today. While less violence is best for the city, it comes with a price of less integration of the neighborhoods. On the other hand, a legally flawless desegregation that is better for education would assure violence. For the long-term success of integration, Garrity decided that a flawless desegregation plan would be best despite the inevitable violence.